As soccer takes center stage this summer, Comcast helps bring the experience home to America. As the exclusive Spanish-language home of the tournament in the U.S., Telemundo is set to present its most expansive coverage ever. 700 hours of programming, live on-site presence at all 104 matches. And with multi-view and real-time 4K, Xfinity will deliver the most innovative and immersive sports viewing experience for fans watching on Telemundo, Peacock, Fox, and FS1. Learn more at ComcastCorporation.com.
Hi everybody, and welcome to the Dr. Psych Mom Show. Today I'm going to be talking about the idea that I invented, as most of the things I talk about are things I invented, that when you're wealthy, you change from a wild animal into a pet. And before we get to what that means and why I thought about it, I will tell you to subscribe. My most recent subscriber episode was Stop with the Solution Hunting. And solution hunting, looking for magic bullets and magic pills, literally or figuratively, is often it stops you from doing the real work of acceptance, and that is the work of life. And if that upsets you to even think about, then it's probably because it's an episode that you should really listen to. And that and about 230 more will be yours if you subscribe. So 25% more of my episodes are subscriber only. Okay, so what do I mean by when you're wealthy, you change from a wild animal to a pet? So a lot of the people I work with are self-made and they grew up hungry. I mean, sometimes literally, more often figuratively. They did not have everything that they wanted. They looked around and they felt that their parents were stuck or struggling. Sometimes they had addiction or depression issues, or sometimes they just were not at the they didn't have an education level that this person would want to have. Sometimes they just didn't have enough money. And there's a lot of people who recount these stories of not having the right clothes, not having the right car, not having, being embarrassed because, frequently parents move to a school district where it's a good school, but then, it's the best school that they can get a house in that district, but then the kid is the poorest one in that district. So whenever a kid grows up feeling different from everybody or different from, people on TV, peers, whatever, then they usually feel self-conscious, which is totally normal because we are pack animals. And sometimes the resolution of people that have the wherewithal and the internal fortitude to do it is to out-earn that problem and make sure that their own children are never in the same situation and they are going to become very successful, very educated so obviously if you get an advanced degree, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're very successful, but financially, but sometimes it does. But these people decide that the best option is to have extra money and that will really help them. And they are very hungry then to make money and to build their business and build, their career. And they're very, very motivated. So then by the time I see them, most of these people are wealthy already, so they've done it, they've achieved it. And then what? That's the question. So if you are used to living in some sort of, survival, fight or flight mode where you genuinely feel that if you do not make money, then you're going to die, and you feel that your self-concept is riding on it, that your family is riding on it, that everybody's depending on you for their, to be financially supported, and you are just kind of every day it's fight or flight, and you're in this turbocharged mode to achieve, then what happens once you make it? Well, a lot of people have an existential crisis at that time, which is why they come into therapy. And they basically are now a person with enough resources that they become not a wild, hungry animal anymore who's hunting for food, but a pet who is pleased and who is loved, and they take care of themselves and their family like they are pets, and everybody gets, has nice clothes and the most beautiful vacations and food that is wonderful, and nobody has to worry about, how much you're spending at the grocery store, so you can ingest, just the most wonderful, organic, perfect food that's the best tasting food in the world, and the restaurants you go to are ideal. And then you go to the gym to exercise your body. And so your physical form is just, also just healthy. And then you have to look for leisure, right? Because you have so much money that it's nonsensical to work all the time. So then you start to look for pleasant little things to do, and you'll get back maybe into sports or the gym or reading more, something like that. And this sounds great, except that the entire self-concept and identity of this person was being a wild animal who's like foraging for food and like hunting all the time and feels like a very, this internal pressure to achieve and perform and create and make money. And now you turn more from a wild animal into a domesticated animal. You're a pet. And what do you do with your pets? You take them out for walks and you feed them the little treats and you play with them. And that's not the life of a wild animal. And I thought about this because we just went to Thailand. My son was in the International Geography bee, and I saw wild animals that are dogs and cats, wild dogs and cats on the street, which you see when you go to other countries sometimes. And always, I'm just so surprised at how they don't look like pets. They just don't look like the cats and dogs at home. It's almost like there's another species or something. And I thought, because this is me, I thought maybe it's because they aren't neutered, right? I'm always thinking about hormones and all those things. And I was like, maybe it's because they all have their sex hormones still, and they're still allowed to live this life of having sex with other animals and, having like a full gender instead of being neutered. And sure, and I'm sure that's part of it. And also they do, even though they are fed by the store owners and stuff where they hang out, they still have to look for food. They still have to really try. Like they got to try. And meanwhile, the cats and dogs at home, the ones that I see in my suburban neighborhood, they are like, in some regard, you'd say they're living the dream, right? They get the perfect food, and then they go places, they get doggy ice cream is the treat right next to the human ice cream, and they get groomed. They don't have to groom themselves. They don't have to do anything. Some of them are on Prozac if they get too anxious, probably too anxious because it's neutered, and they don't have enough meaning. Like seriously, they're probably having existential crises, just like the people I see in this scenario that this podcast is about. But basically, they are pets. They are beloved and coddled and loved and hugged and cuddled, but they're very divorced from their evolutionary purpose, right? They don't have a purpose. They don't have to do anything specifically. They don't have to hunt. They're going to get fed anyway. They don't have to look for shelter. They have shelter and they have a warm home, and they don't have to look for really anything. And when they do look for things like companionship, they get it only within a very strict range, going to the dog park, hanging out with, maybe you have another dog at home, but they can't like just go off and find a partner. Of course, they don't want to because they're neutered. So, it's a very different life than they were supposed to live in the wild. And that is what I see in a lot of people who move from making money, trying to make money, to having money. Having money, it's like they turn into their own pet. They are, going to the spa. Even men, they're getting their hair dyed, and I just heard of a man got his beard dyed. And not a client, a person. Maybe my clients have dyed beards. I wouldn't ask. I wouldn't know. But I heard for the first time about beard dye. And I thought, why doesn't he just shave? But I guess he wants the best of both worlds. He wants the beard, but the beard has to be the right color. But either way, people get into these like extreme optimization. They have to have the most pleasure. They have to wring out the most pleasure and the most... so I'm trying to say, like, in the way that you would want a pet to maximize their life in this world and to have every moment be pleasant and peaceful and fun, that is how you start to treat your own self and certainly your family as well. And that really feels very different and very discordant from the previous identity that many of these people, especially men, but also women, I see many high achieving and self-made women, it's very different from their earlier self-concept when they were trying to make the business or to get started or to launch their product or whatever the case may be. So sometimes this leads to kind of an existential crisis because people could do this life of leisure, this pet life for like 1 year. And then it really starts to chafe. They don't like to lay by the pool. They don't like to optimize their body fat in the gym. They don't like to go to all the best restaurants. You know, it starts to seem like kind of one of my favorite books, The Beautiful and Damned by F. Scott Fitzgerald. And it just starts to feel kind of meaningless. And of course, it is kind of meaningless. And so therefore, at some point, these people have to figure out what is their second mountain, what is their second path, what are they going to do to provide more meaning in their life. They're not a wild animal and they can't go back to being a wild animal because they're not actually hungry anymore. Now, some people, by the way, they delude themselves. They say, well, you know, I always thought my family needed, you know, 100,000 a year when I was younger. Now I realize that they need to consume $2 million a year worth of stuff. So therefore I'm hungry again because I've convinced myself that I need to be making that much every year for the rest of my life. And, you know, and I need to make all these investments, you know, and I need to do all these things. And they try to convince themselves back into the wild animal state. And for some people they can, but other people look deeper than that and they say, but I actually have all of this money and security, so I am not, in fact, a wild animal, and I don't want to be a pet, so what am I going to be? And that's the work. That's the work of midlife, and that's the work of success and the existential crises that follow success, is figuring out what is your path. And so frequently these people, and you could read the book, The Second Mountain, on this, but frequently these people turn to giving back in some way, to being charitable or to creating some sort of product that helps other people, not just to make money or to mentor people or to coach people. I mean, that's a real kind of common one for the existential crisis self-made man, is to turn into somebody who facilitates the development of others. And this can be useful too. Now, remember what else goes along with being a wild animal that I mentioned is the neutered. You're not neutered when you're a wild animal. So a lot of sexual desire was kind of sublimated into career success and the constant, you know, passionate drive of success, financial success. And yeah, you had sex and, you know, if you have a normal sex drive, but it wasn't like the main thing because you had this other hunger. The animal needs food before it can have sex, right? But now when you have your food and you are a pet but not neutered, and in fact, a lot of guys go on testosterone at this time as well in terms of the optimization of the physical form, then they have all this sex drive but nowhere to sublimate it into the way that they did before. Because again, a hunter has got to find food for the tribe before they think about sex, right? Because the species can't survive with no food. That's really a more immediate concern than having sex. And so when these guys, usually guys, I've only seen this in guys, when they get to be financially successful and they no longer need to, quote, hunt, then they turn to, what am I going to do with all this life force, all this drive? Oh, won't my wife be happy that I want to have sex now 5 times a week? No, she's not. Because remember, she was the wife of the hunter and the wild animal. And she was somebody that was okay being at home while the wild animal hunted on his own. And so she's not going to turn into somebody who wants the pet. Not only does she have the pet all day on the couch, but then she has to have sex with the pet. No thanks. She doesn't want that because she's not that person. She never was. That's why you're able to be a wild animal to begin with. So this is when some couples need to get into couples therapy to figure out what's going to be the new dynamic in light of the financial change, which is something most people don't talk about, quite honestly. It is a very sensitive topic that people really have not brought up, is we have all this money, how has it changed us? And it's very important to have those open conversations so that people can, you know, not grow distant and awkward with each other because this is such a, you know, tacky thing to talk about, but instead recognize that it is a real variable that really changes the dynamic from what it was before. All right, guys, I hope you liked my ideas about the wild animal versus the pet and found it entertaining as well as insightful. That is my goal. And I'll talk to everybody soon. Have a great day, guys.